Welcome to the Pursuit of Learning podcast. I'm your host, Clint Murphy. My goal is for each of us to grow personally, professionally, and financially, one conversation at a time. To do that, we will have conversations with subject matter experts across a variety of modalities. My job as your host will be to dig out those golden nuggets of wisdom that will facilitate our growth. Join me on this pursuit. As a straight, white, able-bodied man, or SWAM, as today's guest Michael Bach describes it, I know the importance of diversity and inclusion, but I don't necessarily know how to do it right. That's where my conversation with Michael about his book, Birds of All Feathers, comes into play. Since recording this conversation, I've already had some great chats about diversity and inclusion with friends and colleagues. I hope that you are able to take away some things that will help you in your life. Enjoy. Good morning, Michael. I'd love to start our conversation with you where I start with a lot of my guests, which is really understanding what's motivating you in life right now, and what are 2 or 3 things that you want to make sure we get across to the listeners in our conversation today.
What a great question. What's motivating me right now? Well, this has been an incredibly challenging, exhausting 18 months. Aside from that whole pandemic-y thing, which you may not have heard about, but aside from that, with George Floyd's death, brought just a total onslaught of attention to the work that I do. And so really what's motivating me right now is to continue to grow my organization and look for efficiencies and make sure that people are comfortable and that they're working effectively and they're not burning out. And, that's the type of thing that really motivates me. I mean, we're in a pinnacle moment, I think, transformative moment that I find very exciting. And I live in this very weird world where my personal and professional lives are essentially the same because I have such a personal passion around my work that I don't really turn it off at night. It's not like I work at, Starbucks and I hang up my apron and I go home and I don't make lattes at home. I think about my work all the time.
Which even ties to the conversation we're having today, which is your book, Birds of All Feather, Doing Diversity and Inclusion Right. And so when you wrote Birds of All Feathers, what was your motivation and who was your demographic for reading it?
Yeah, when I wrote the book, I was at a point where I was really tired of answering the same questions over and over. When you're working in diversity and inclusion, you sort of get it to a point where you hear the same thing over and over. How do I write a business case? What's the way to do diversity right? And when I looked across the market at books that were available, there were really 2 types of books. Ones that were written by academics, which were brilliant literature, but completely unrealistic. Academics, and meaning no offense to them, they tend to come up with these great ideas that are largely not necessarily practical in terms of actual execution in a live environment. And the others are written by consultants who just want to sell you something. And I wanted a book that just gave away all the secrets and really was a roadmap to how to at least begin your journey in diversity and inclusion, if not start to think about your journey a little differently. The target audience was really it was really broad, but at its core, it was small to medium-sized enterprise. The big organizations, the government of BC, the Bank of Canada, the banks, they've got, first of all, scads of money, and they've got lots of people who can do this work. And one of the challenges I think small to medium-sized enterprise faces, they don't have a full-time D&I person. They barely have full-time HR people. And this work can be quite daunting when there's not someone there who can do it, has the expertise. So I really thought of them when I was writing the book. But then over time, it kind of expanded in audience to be pretty much anybody who really was trying to figure this stuff out. Middle managers, senior executives, regardless of size of organization.
And so for a young person who, let's say if the target listeners, 25 to 40, growing in their career, they want to grow personally, professionally, and financially. When they pick up the book, what are 2 or 3 takeaways you want for them to be able to move ahead in life that way? How's it going to help them?
I think the first thing it'll do is help them to be a better manager, right? Understanding a little more about diversity and inclusion, equity, accessibility, these words, what do they mean? What do they mean particularly when you don't come from an equity-seeking group? And just to lay it out, straight, white, able-bodied men predominantly. But at the same time, it's not exclusive to them. Women, people of color, other groups who they don't necessarily have all of the skills and experience to do this work. So this can really help people to be better managers, to understand business structure as it relates to inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. That's really where younger people will get a lot out of it. I find with younger people, there's a lot more openness to this conversation. That if you're right, like if you're 35 and you grew up in wherever, the lower mainland of Vancouver, of British Columbia, Atlanta, wherever, you have an understanding of difference. What you may not have is an understanding of how this work should and can be done inside an organization that in a deliberate manner. I find there is a bit of naivete amongst young people who sort of think, well, what's the big deal? Why can't we just all get along? Well, okay, let me explain why we can't just all get along. And it's not that we don't want to get along, but there is a whole list of stuff that gets in the way. And the approach of the book is very much about how do you do this in a sustainable way that really is about change for everyone's benefit.
Which is one of the keys we're going to talk about as we go through our conversation, as well as what are some of the challenges, as you mentioned, with some of the old models, which tend to fall into that why can't we just get along category. One of the things that interests me, and it just came up as you were mentioning how much more in tune young people are with this. Have you ever seen, Michael, any of the Darman videos on YouTube, as an example?
Don't think so.
He's a person that does videos that are all about diversity and inclusion, and they're just short little 10-15 minute videos. They all have a short little story. The acting seems not the highest level, but the kids love them, and every single one is about teaching a different lesson and changing lives. And it just seems to make the kids see almost so many different D&I situations done wrong, because that's what the clips do, is they show someone just behaving in an abhorrent way and why that's wrong. And it's, the kids just love it. And I thought it was, horrible television. And then I started watching it, and I ended up watching 6 to 10 videos in a row. I went down the rabbit hole. So I'm now a big fan of the Darman videos and what they teach the kids. So I'm very happy if they spend hours watching that.
Yeah, that's a good use of YouTube time as opposed to cat videos.
Yeah, exactly. Unboxing videos. Michael, Birds of All Feathers, why the title?
So the original title was Laying the Dead Moose on the Table. And it was meant to be a provocative, if you're not familiar with the phrase, dead moose on the table is sort of pink elephant in the room, just more Canadian and more violent. And my publishers were surprisingly not okay with that title. And so we went through quite a extensive process of figuring out what the core of the book was about. In its essence, it's about creating space where everyone can come together and be themselves. So instead of a bird of a feather, it's birds of all feathers, meaning that it doesn't matter what kind of bird you are. This nest is for you. We're trying to build nests where all birds can come together. So it's a metaphor. And it's one that really resonated with me throughout that process. Was ultimately what we're trying to do is create space where everyone can bring all of themselves to work, that they don't have to leave something at the door. They don't have to hide whoever they are or assimilate or what have you. We talk about diversity and inclusion as an ecosystem, and how if you think about, say, a fishbowl, that if the pH balance isn't right, if there's something wrong in the water, that the fish will not survive. The fish will not thrive. And workplaces are similar in that sense, where if I'm different, however we define different, and I'm not able to bring that piece of me to work, I then have to hide, I have to adapt, or I leave. And so we want to create a workplace where people don't have to do that, that they can bring all of themselves to work and they can thrive. So that's what the title's about.
A nest where all the birds can work together regardless of their characteristics. I love it. So let's start diving into the book. And let's start where you start off. You say diversity and inclusion are buzzwords. So can we pull back the curtain, and what do these words really mean, and why do they matter?
Yeah, so diversity is in essence about difference. If you look it up in the dictionary definition, it really means difference. Historically, when we've talked about diversity, we've talked about equity deserving groups, people who have been quote unquote marginalized, women, people of color, indigenous people, people with disabilities, and LGBTQ2 plus folks. But I argue that diversity is about anything that makes you unique. And by definition, then straight, white, able-bodied men are diverse. They're not marginalized or underrepresented, to be very clear, but they are still diverse. Inclusion is about creating space, creating that nest where people can come to work and do their jobs and be successful, however they define success. And they don't have to hide those things that make them unique. There's a couple other words that we use as part of our acronym. We use the acronym IDEA: inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. Equity is about understanding that not everybody has access to the same thing. So I grew up in a very middle class household. We never had to worry about money. My parents paid for my education. We always had the greatest, latest toys and computers. I had a computer in high school, and I went to high school just before the creation of electricity. So I had a very different lived experience than somebody who grew up in, a lower income family, multiple kids, maybe a single parent working multiple jobs, didn't have access to a computer, couldn't afford to pay for university or college. And that person would have a very different lived experience. There's a picture online that gets used quite frequently, and it's three people trying to watch a baseball game over a fence. And the three people are different heights. One person's really short, can't see over the fence at all. One person is, about the height of the fence and they can kind of peek over, and then one person's really tall. That's inequity, because the fence, if you make the assumption that they all have the same opportunity, the fence is the barricade. The next image is of the two shorter people on different size apple boxes so they can see over the fence as well. So equity is about making sure that we're leveling the playing field. And then, of course, accessibility is about accessibility. And it's about physical accessibility. It's about accessibility in every form. It tends to relate to people with disabilities, but there's other forms of accessibility around faith and religion, sexuality, gender, any number of things.
Okay, and so we will dive into some of those definitions. In one of the first chapters, you actually spent an entire chapter defining some key terms, and I'm wondering if there are any other ones that you think may be relevant to our listeners before we dive into some of the topics. Some of the ones that jumped out at me as an example: representation, equality versus equity, accommodation, intersectionality, and there was a broad one: sex, sexual identity, gender, and gender expression, which you defined really well. And I think a lot of older listeners may not know, or even younger listeners may not know the differences between the four.
Yeah. It's, I mean, I could sit here for the next few hours talking about different words. I think I wrote a chapter about that is essentially a glossary, and it's up front. I think it's chapter 2. I did that because if you don't understand the definitions of the words, the rest of the book is just going to be very difficult to understand. The one word that you mentioned that I think is really important for listeners to understand is intersectionality. And this is a concept that was coined in the 1980s by a professor named Kimberly Crenshaw. And essentially what it helps us to understand is the complexity of identities when combined together. So let's take women as an example. So we look at women and we think about that women have a similar lived experience. But when you layer on the intersection of race and ethnicity, we see that women of color compared to white women have a very different lived experience. And then when you layer on place of birth or place of origin, again, more complexity appears. And there's it's old data. It's from, I think, 2012 or something, that looked at the median income for men and women with a college education, and then also layered on newcomer status. And what it found was that white men with a college education median income was something like 68,000, and women, it was something like 52,000. And newcomer women, immigrant women without a college or university degree, their average income was something like 18,000. It's a massive disparity. And the whole point of intersectionality is you cannot treat one group as a homogeneous group. You cannot look at all women the same. You cannot look at all people of color the same. You cannot look at all LGBTQ2 plus people the same, because we have varying life experiences. That intersectionality lens changes things in a very dramatic way. So if you grew up in Canada or the United States versus you're an immigrant to Canada or the United States, that is an intersection. And if you layer on sexuality, if you layer on all these things, it can get complex. It's my biggest complaint about terms like visible minority or people of color or racialized people, because it groups literally millions of people under one term. And the lived experiences of a Black person compared to the lived experience of a Latinx person versus a South Asian, East Asian, etc., they're very different. And it's important to understand those intersections as part of this conversation around inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility.
I appreciate that. And I definitely learned a lot from that one. And you're even layering in, to your point, education levels, socioeconomic status, childhood. And I'm sure you can even start to layer in, were you in a single parent family, two parent family, abusive family? There's so much that goes into the formation of someone's lived experience that isn't above the surface. We don't even know without having conversations and learning about that person, and even learning about them, we probably can't even fully understand the depth of their lived experience, because when you start to think about it, the person who's living the lived experience probably doesn't even fully understand how it's shaped them. A lot of it would be subconscious. So, Michael, you talked about earlier the why can't we all just get along? And that reminds me of the social justice model, which is the old model that's typically been used for diversity and inclusion. Can you let our listeners know what is that old social justice model and why doesn't it work?
Well, the social justice model stems from the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, which in a nutshell, and this is a very quick summation, is that a straight, white, able-bodied man had to lose in order for others to gain. And we hear it sometimes where, people say, well, we have to diversify the leadership. We have to, get rid of half the leadership team and make it more diverse, which is so dismissive of people's skills and experience. And the reason why it doesn't work is it requires straight, white, able-bodied men to give up power. It treats them in, frankly, a very negative light. And of course, if I have to give up power, why is this of interest to me? Why does it matter? And considering that the vast majority of leaders, quote unquote, in this country, in the Western world, are straight, white, able-bodied men. It doesn't work because I'm not incentivized to give up power. I don't see the benefit to me. And regardless of who you are, we work from a place of self-interest. Everyone works from a place of self-interest. What's in it for me? And the social justice model does not help us understand what's in it for me.
And even, if you I can put myself in the shoes of that person. You ask yourself, well, why can't I have that job? Isn't that the job I've worked my whole life for? Well, why am I not okay to have it? What's wrong with me? Right. And that puts you in a position where if you're told, well, this person, or this person should have it for these reasons, it tells you, well, wait, aren't I good enough?
Ultimately, it marginalizes straight, white, able-bodied men, which I'm going to say that and then people's heads just exploded. But ultimately, that's what the social justice model will do, is it will marginalize people who, like you say, feel like, well, now I don't have the same opportunity because of something that I can't impact, I can't affect. And that's not to say that all straight, white, able-bodied men are deserving of being the CEO or being in leadership positions or what have you. It's to say that in using the social justice model, we are creating the circumstances, or we're emulating the circumstances which have traditionally marginalized women, people of color, people with disabilities, Indigenous people, and LGBTQ2 folks.
And we're effectively, when you talk about taking away power, we're effectively creating an us versus them model, as opposed to what you write about, which is the creativity and innovation model. Can you tell us how this model works and why it's more beneficial for all the groups involved in the equation?
Yeah. So creativity and innovation model is about addressing the problems that we face on a day-to-day basis as a business, as a municipality, as a whatever. We're always facing challenges. And the whole idea with that model is using diversity and inclusion as a means to address the problems. The lack of diversity and inclusion is not the problem. It's, I can't find enough people. We can't retain people. We don't have enough customers, whatever. That's the problem. Diversity and inclusion is the means to solve the problem. And it's about making sure that we are creating space where the cream rises to the top. Literally, everyone who has the potential can rise to the top. And I'll give you an example. I worked for an organization once where the leadership of the organization was, I think, about 75% straight, white, able-bodied men. And yet when you looked at the entry-level jobs, it was more than 50% women. It was about another 20, 25% people of color, if you don't double dip with women of color. So 75% of the entry-level positions were women and people of color. And what was happening was that they were exiting the organization at a point because there wasn't the same opportunity for them. They were being overlooked for promotions. And the organization used to say, oh, we have the best and the brightest in our leadership. And my argument was, no, you don't. Statistically, you don't. You have the best and the brightest of the ones that survived. And the creativity and innovation model is about making sure that the best and the brightest stay, regardless of what they look like, regardless of how they identify. And it's about making sure that we are taking advantage of all of the skills that exist. And we're not leaving any at the door. And it's about everyone succeeding.
And as you talk about that, something that jumps out at me, we've talked about it on a few episodes, is a scarcity versus abundance mindset. And when I look at the two models that we're talking about, it seems that the social justice model is a bit of a scarcity model, which is there's only so much, so we have to take away from one group to give to another. Whereas with your innovation and creativity model, we're saying, well, no, if we add diversity and inclusion, we're going to have abundance. We're going to have more customers. We're going to broaden our customer base. We're going to have more colleagues so we can do more. Hence, everybody is a winner. There aren't ideally losers in this model.
Yeah, that's the idea.
Okay. And so one thing I love as a CFO by day is that you start off by saying that a rock solid business case is the bedrock of any D&I platform. Why is that?
Because if you don't know why you're doing it, why are you doing it? I mean, the business case is just about the why. It's just about the why does it matter? And when we say things like it's the right thing to do, which is very much a social justice mantra, it assumes we all know it's the right thing to do. And it assumes we all believe it's the right thing to do. And there are people who think, well, what about me? And if you don't have a solid business case that says this is how it's going to impact the organization if we don't do something, and this is how it's going to impact the organization if we do something, if you can't go back to that sort of guiding principle, that tangible touchstone that says this is why it matters, then ultimately you will steer off course. It is really important. This work is difficult at times, and it is very much about change. If you don't have that concrete, here's why we're doing this, this is why it matters to our business. If you don't have that, you risk getting off course.
And, it may seem to our listeners that it seems obvious we should do these things. But something that jumps out at me as we're talking about it is often the people you're having the conversations with to try to move these initiatives forward, they're often a different generation, right? We talked about early in the conversation, the younger and younger we look at, that 35-year-old person probably understands all of this. I'm already over that bracket. That
Not universally, though.
Not universally.
Right? Like age is not a universal indicator.
It's not a universal indicator. I think part of where I'm going, though, is that the older we get, it's not universal. And I expect that the understanding of the conversation we have today is lower the higher the age we go. And the people that tend to run the businesses that are making the decisions tend to be older. They tend to be straight, white, able-bodied men. And so our goal then, and the importance of the business case, is to be able to say to that straight, white, able-bodied man, this is why us changing the way we do things will be beneficial for you and your business, and getting them on side. Even if we're approaching it from a do the right thing perspective, you're right. Telling someone, hey, you're not doing the right thing never wins anybody over in life.
Well, it comes down to that right versus wrong. And this is not about right versus wrong. This is shades of gray at its finest. It is about what motivates. And the other piece of that puzzle is, of course, if there is, an economic shift, say the 2008 economic crisis, and we're still in that right thing to do approach, well, when you're struggling to keep people employed, the right thing to do is cut costs. And if you're viewing diversity and inclusion as a nice program, a nice to have, that gets cut.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if it's about the success of your organization, there's no cut. It doesn't get touched because this is about the success of your organization. And a lot of leaders, regardless of their age or identity, they're constantly looking at the bottom line. How much money are we making? And if they have to cut, they're going to cut something that they don't quite understand.
And building that business case, Michael, we're looking at really, you're focusing in on three things: people, customers, and brands. And I'd like to spend a little bit of time on each of those with you. On the people side, one of our goals is to have an employee population that represents the available workforce population or the community you serve. And I think that available workforce population, you do a good job of explaining how that might not match up exactly with the community we serve. Can you take our listeners through some examples of why those aren't the same thing? And then we can talk about the next steps in people.
Yeah. So unfortunately, we have lousy data when it comes to understanding who our potential employee population are. We tend to go with census data on the metropolitan areas. So here's what city of Calgary looks like. Here's what the city of San Francisco looks like. It's pretty basic. It doesn't take into account the specialty, the skills. So you and I used to both work for an accounting firm. That accounting firm hires accountants. It's kind of a thing. They hire doctors and nurses and consultants and all sorts of people. But not everybody has the skills to get hired by that organization. So you may look at let's go with Vancouver. 63% of the greater Vancouver area are people of color. Well, not all 63% have the skills to work for an accounting firm. So it's important to differentiate between the community that you serve and the available talent. Let's say a hospital's hired doctors and nurses and lab technicians and predominantly people in the medical industry. There are others, communications and finance, et cetera. But, the entire population of Vancouver does not all have a medical degree. So it's an important differentiator when you're looking at your representation that you don't necessarily compare yourself to the community that you serve, but try to find some data that speaks to the available talent.
So if a requirement for this job is having this degree, and then try to find the data of, who in our city has that degree? And one of the importances you identify is making sure that you're not putting into their qualifications that aren't needed, that would needlessly eliminate some of the people. Because you might say, we want people who have this degree, who have a GPA above this, who only went to this school.
Exactly.
And you just eliminated a swath of people.
You have to be willing to ask yourself the question, why does this role need this degree? If you're hiring a doctor, medical degree, absolutely required. If you're hiring a manager for retail store, why is the degree required? You really have to be willing to unpack some of that, because we do get stuck in this mindset that, they need to have, a bachelor's degree. Why? You potentially eliminate people. Frankly, my bachelor's degree was a bit of a waste of time. And the willingness to unpack that and really ask the questions about what are the bona fide occupational requirements, the actual skills you need to do a job. What you do is ultimately open yourself up to more potential talent.
And let's say we do that work and we look at it and say, okay, the work says that 63% of my workforce should probably be people of color because there's no barriers. And it's only 20%. What's the next step?
So there's a few things. First is making sure that the environment is inclusive. So, there's an adage we use that when you've got a flower that isn't doing well in your garden, it's not the flower's fault. It's the soil. It's the garden. And if you go out and say, okay, we're only going to hire people of color for the next year to adjust our representation, you may be sending the lamb into the lion's den. So you want to make sure that the environment is inclusive. You want to make sure that people are trained and educated in what is their role in creating an inclusive environment. You want to make sure that policies and procedures are in place to address issues that may come from the diversification of your workforce. You want to make sure that the garden is as fertile as possible before you then go out and hire a whole bunch of people of color. So the inclusion part needs to come first.
And this is why you also put retention ahead of attraction. Because unless we have an inclusive environment, it doesn't matter if we attract diversity because we'll lose it. If we build an environment that is inclusive, that people want to be a part of, then we can attract diversity because it will want to stay.
Absolutely. I was doing some work for a client that was super proud of this program that they had, which was focused on attracting people of color. And something like 80% of their new hires were people of color. And then we broke down and looked at their voluntary turnover rate through a race and ethnicity lens. And their voluntary turnover rate had spiked through the roof because they were sending people into an exclusionary environment where they were facing issues of racism and discrimination and bias. And they had to shut down the program and focus on the garden. They had to focus on the inclusion piece to make sure they were going to retain the people that they were hiring.
And so what are some things in the workplace that we can do to make it a more inclusive environment? When we talk about education as an example, what is the communication that we have with our colleagues to educate them on what inclusion looks like and bringing that up to the level it needs to be?
First and foremost, it's that everyone has a job to play. Everyone plays a role in creating an inclusive work environment. It's not one person's job. It's everyone's job. Because I can create the policy that says thou shalt be inclusive. That means nothing. It's up to the individual, and every single individual has the power to create an inclusive environment or to create an exclusionary environment through subtle behavior oftentimes. So it's about making sure that every single person has that understanding of their role in creating the inclusionary environment. It's not about you have to be an expert in diversity and inclusion. That's not it at all. You have to do your job in an inclusive way. You have to be aware of your unconscious bias. You have to be aware of your privilege and think about others. At first, it takes some adjustment, but once you get used to it, it just becomes part of how you do everything, your day-to-day life. So that's an important part. It is important to have the policies and procedures. It's important to have all of that articulated in a way that you can reference back to the policy, to the procedure to say, no, this is how we do it. And no, this, your behavior was not in line with our code of conduct or our religious accommodation policy or whatever. So it's important to have those. But ultimately, a policy or a procedure is only as valuable as the paper it's written on if the individuals are not executing on that policy or procedure in the intended way.
And so let's assume we've done that and we have them executing on it in the right way. And so we have an inclusive workforce. And we then look at it and say, okay, well, our numbers don't match up. And you talk about the importance of numbers and statistics and how they can tell us if our hiring practices are statistically improbable. Because the next part in attracting, there's multiple facets of it. And the first one is to say, well, are you attracting the right candidates? How do the statistics tell us whether we are or we aren't, Michael?
Well, you have to look at the entire life cycle of the hiring process. So the hiring process doesn't start and end with the candidate that you hire. It starts with the job posting you create. So making sure that your job posting is using inclusive language, that it's not inadvertently excluding in some way, shape, or form. And there's some programs out there that will analyze the text of your job postings to see if they are using inclusive language. And then it's who applies to the job and looking at the percentages of identity, the number of women that apply, the number of people of color, et cetera, et cetera. And it's collecting that data. And yes, you can collect that data as part of the application process. It's a very simple process on how to do that. But if you don't collect it, you don't know who's applying and you're guessing. And you should never, ever guess. So then you look at who gets screened in. And sorry, backing up to that, you then can compare the percentages, the numbers of people who are applying to your job posting against some form of data. We have terrible data sources here. So it's really, I say this and then I say, oh, we have lousy data. You can compare it to the population of the community that you serve, understanding that that is not entirely an accurate barometer of what the community should look like. So if you compare it to Vancouver and you see that only, 40% of your applicants for the accountant job are people of color, that's maybe not so bad. That's not that far out of line. If it's 10%, you have a big problem, particularly in accounting. But let's use something more dramatic. If you are hiring someone to be a long haul trucker and 10% of your applicants are women, you're doing great because the average of women in long haul trucking is like 3%. If it's 50%, then you actually are out of line with available talent. So it goes both ways. It's not exclusive to people who are from equity deserving groups. So then you see who gets screened in and then who gets an interview, who gets through the process and who gets hired. Statistically speaking, they should look the same. If 50% of my applicants are women, if 50% of my applicants are people of color, then by the time I get to a short list, statistically, that list should look somewhat similar. If you get 1,000 applicants and you take it down to a short list of 10, let's say, just because that's an easy number to do. And again, 50% are women and your short list of 10 has no women on it. Something's gone wrong throughout the process because considering that 50% of the population are female, statistically speaking, in certain professions, there is an expectation that you will have 50% women. It depends on the profession. This is a big caveat. 92% of nursing degrees go to women. And only 25% of engineering degrees go to women. So if you've got 50% women in your engineering pool, you're actually higher than the available talent. But in your nursing pool, you're dramatically lower than the available talent. So it's looking at your hiring process, the entire life cycle of it, and applying that demographic lens to understand if at some point during the process, bias creeps in and throws you off course.
And part of the goal with tracking it along each step is to figure out where we're getting thrown off course.
Exactly.
And how to fix it. Okay. Let's flip to customers, Michael. Why is diversity so important for us, for our customers?
Well, it depends who you're doing business with. And everyone has a customer. This is really important for people, particularly, the public sector, nonprofit. I don't have a customer. Yes, you do. A city has a customer. It's the residents of your city. A hospital has a customer. It's the patient. A university has the customer. It's the student. Everyone has a customer in some way, shape, or form. And you need to understand the needs of your customer. If you don't have a customer, you don't have a business. You don't have a hospital. You don't, right? So if I'm a university and I am experiencing high levels of complaints related to racism, then students of color are going to look at that and say, I'm not going there. Well, where are we seeing statistically the increase in representation? It's amongst people of color. So we're not in a position to exclude anybody. And it's not about tokenism. It's about understanding your customer. So I'll give you an example. 48% of the residents of the city of Toronto speak something other than English or French at home. Whether we like it or not, there's a percentage of people that call Canada home that do not speak one of our official languages. Family reunification programs have meant that parents and grandparents have moved to Canada and they don't have a grasp of the language. So if I am the city of Toronto, I need to make sure that my services are offered in languages other than English and French, because I need to be able to service my customer. I'll give you another example, and it's a bit of a dramatic one, but this happened to a friend of mine. His in-laws are both from China. Very little English. They went to the doctor. The mother-in-law was having some health problems. Doctor was explaining things to them. They're nodding away. And then a few weeks later, the hospital called, and it just happened that their daughter was at home. And they said, why has Mrs. Chan not come back in? And she said, I didn't know Mrs. Chan had to come back in. What's going on? Mrs. Chan had stage 4 breast cancer. And the doctor had assumed, incorrectly, that Mrs. Chan had a grasp of the English language and was relaying some very tough information that she didn't get at all. So if you don't understand your customer, you're not able to serve your customer. And that's just, those are just simple examples, and they're a bit dramatic. But let's say you are Starbucks, okay? And you want to open stores in, let's say, Abbotsford, which has a very large South Asian population. Do South Asian people drink coffee in the same way that Caucasian people do? Are there special products that you might want to stock in your store in Abbotsford to be more attractive? Maybe you have more tea than you have coffee. You need to understand your customer. It's not a universal customer. Not all people who call Canada home are exactly the same. And if you want to attract a particular market, you need to understand that market. And there may be, not guaranteed, but there may be some differences that you need to take into consideration.
And something you mentioned in there, and you gave a good example of it in the book, was the concept of tokenism and why that's not what we're going for. And you've had some examples in your career where you've seen tokenism done horribly wrong. Can you share with our listeners what tokenism means if they don't know, and some examples or an example of where you've seen it done horribly wrong?
Yeah, well, tokenism is where you say, we need the black guy. We're doing a pitch for a client and they expect diversity, so go get the receptionist. And she can be we'll take her to the meeting. What happens if they ask her a question? Tokenism is about putting people into positions that they're not ready for, that they don't have the skills to do the job. Tokenism is insulting at best and just a bad business decision at worst. There are many examples of tokenism. And actually, we're seeing it a lot right now in the profession of inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility, where because of George Floyd's death, a lot of organizations are now for the first time hiring D&I practitioners or hiring more senior people into D&I roles. And there's a lot of tokenism going on where they'll say, oh, no, we have to have a person of color for this role. What? You have to have a person of color? Why? Because they have to have the lived experience? Well, first of all, that's trauma porn. It's expecting somebody who has lived experience to magically be able to change your environment. It's also putting huge burdens on people of color to say, oh, well, we spent hundreds of years making this disaster and treating people horribly, but now we are going to empower you to fix it. Thanks.
And not really empower you because we aren't investing in this properly. You're our figurehead of diversity and inclusion. How do you feel about that?
We got a black head of diversity who has zero experience. And then magically, when they fail in their jobs, because they don't have the skills and experience to do the job. Oh my, that's a surprise. And that's not to say that there aren't people of color who have some great experience in diversity and inclusion. There absolutely are. But we are seeing a huge push on tokenism right now, specifically around Black and Indigenous folks. And I want to see better employment for Black and Indigenous folks. Absolutely. But it is not as simple as saying, go out and hire some Black and Indigenous folks. We have to make sure that the environment is an inclusive one. We have to make sure that they have the skills and experience to do the job. There's a long list of things that we need to do to make sure that they're successful. Otherwise, in a couple years, this is where we're going to say, oh, well, we tried that diversity thing and it didn't work out.
It's not in line with the business case. It's more in line with the social justice model. Let's just get them in that seat without a plan for what they're going to do.
This is what happened in the United States in the 1950s and 60s with the Affirmative Action Act, which was about giving preference to people of color. And what happened was that people who didn't have the skills to do a job were getting promoted into positions, and it created resentment, and it was just gross tokenism. They weren't dealing with the underlying issues, the systemic change that needed to happen.
And so earlier we talked about, but we only briefly talked about it, the difference between equality and equity. Can we talk a little bit about that? Because I think some listeners may not know, and I've done a decent amount of listening on the difference between equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. And I think what I'm hearing, Michael, is that what we're really focusing on with everything we're doing is on equality of opportunity, on setting up the systems properly to allow everyone to have the opportunity to get to where they deserve, versus equality of outcome, which can tend to lead to tokenism. Am I accurate on the differentiation between the two?
But it is the difference between equality and equity is treating everyone the same, and equity is recognizing that people have different needs.
Okay, sorry, mixing those two up. So I'm more hearing equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome.
Right. The difference, the caveat to what you just said is that you have to understand that not everyone has the same opportunity, that not everyone has the same access to opportunity. I'll give you an example. 6% of Canadians do not have high-speed internet. So if you can only apply for a job through your website, 6% of Canadians are not able to apply for that job. Now you think, oh, well, that's a small number. It's fine. Poof. They're mostly in the north. It's not a big deal. But that means that you are losing out on 6% of the population. So it's not easy enough to say everyone has the same opportunity because everyone can just go to our website and anybody can apply for a job. That's not actually true. It's understanding that to treat people equitably, we have to take into consideration a variety of factors. I liken it to us going through a bit of social reengineering, and it's social reengineering that I'm quite in favor of. It's reaching down and creating change. I'll give you an example. I was working with a client who really wanted to increase the representation of Indigenous people in the organization, and they just couldn't understand why they weren't able to attract Indigenous people. And this is a skilled labor organization. You have to have degrees and lots of experience. It's a law firm. And I said, yeah, we can absolutely put a plan together for you. It's going to take about 15 years to bear fruit. Because if you look at the statistics, roughly 50% of Indigenous kids don't graduate grade 8. Of the ones that do, 50% don't graduate high school. So by the time you get to high school graduation, you're at 25% of the student population. And then they, some of them go into college and university, some of them don't. I can't remember the exact number. And they're going into a wide variety of degree programs. So my argument to this law firm was to say, you have to go into the elementary schools and you have to help kids understand that law is a profession that has lots of opportunity. You have to support them because, of course, if their parents didn't graduate grade 8, their parents may not necessarily have the tools to help them in high school. They may not have the desire to help them. They may think, well, I didn't graduate, so why do you need to graduate? Education isn't that important, right? It's a cycle. that needs to be broken. And so you have to go, you have to start at the elementary school level. You have to help the kids all the way through high school. You have to help the kids into college and university. And I'm not talking necessarily about paying for it. And the myth that all Indigenous people get free education is just that. It's a myth. So there may be some of that. But it's also about mentoring. It's about support systems. It will bear fruit in 10 to 15 years. But if we aren't putting in the effort now, and we're not, then we will not see that effort in 10 to 15 years. We'll just see what we've always seen. So it's taking that equity into consideration as part of your desire to have equal opportunity.
Recognizing where it's falling short and trying to close the gap. To, going back to your baseball example, to make sure everyone can at least see the field. Okay, and the third part of our business case is brand. Why is D&I so important to our brand?
It's about, people get confused by the word brand. I'm not talking about your logo. I'm talking about how you're known. How are you known in the market? So if I'm applying for a job, how are you known? If I'm looking at you as a supplier, how are you known? And I'll use it's a bit of a dated example, but it's a good one. So the CEO of Target in the United States in 2010, I think. It's a long story. Made a donation to a Republican political action committee. They were very anti-LGBT, caused a huge backlash, and there was a boycott against Target with the LGBTQ community. If I'm an LGBTQ2 plus person at that moment, and I look at Target, I go, maybe it's not a place for me. And there are lots of examples of that where, law firms that have had their partner compensation leaked, which shows that women are undercompensated in comparison to men. Well, if I'm a woman and I see that, I think, I don't necessarily want to go work at that firm. So your brand impacts who you hire and who you do business with. It's a trinity. The pieces are interconnected, and it's impossible to not focus on all of those three things. Your people, your customer, and your brand are all interwoven into one. So it's not just, as an example, if I'm at the Starbucks in Abbotsford and I walk in and everyone's white, is that really an environment I want to be in? It's Abbotsford. 60% of the population are people of color. It's Brampton. It's the same thing. If I go into a store in Brampton, Ontario, where 73% of the population aren't white and everyone behind the counter is white, there's a problem. There's a bit of a famous story. It's a large personal tax preparation company that wanted to get into the Latinx market, which is worth billions of dollars in the US. And they were opening stores in predominantly Latinx communities. They had advertisements in Spanish. And on day one, they opened the stores and nobody spoke Spanish, not a single person. And of course, the community went, wait a second, what are you doing to support the community? Do you have any Latinx executives? Do you have a Latinx employee resource group? They had nothing. It was a marketing exercise. And this is where the pieces got disconnected, because they were focused on the customer and they had done no work on the people. And the brand ended up getting hugely damaged within this community because they hadn't done their homework. The three things are interconnected, and we could talk about weaving in suppliers and compliance, but I think at the core, those three things are the critical features.
So one of the things that you say, Michael, that I found interesting was that diversity is a fact and inclusion is a choice. What did you mean by that?
So individuals' diversity doesn't change just because you don't like it. I'm gay. I live with an invisible disability. That you don't have to like it. It's not going away. Diversity exists. And diversity has existed since the beginning of time. As soon as you have two human beings in a room, you have some form of human diversity. Even if those people have similar lived experience, they grew up in the same place, they're the same ethnic group, they're the same gender, even identical twins, you have some form of diversity. It doesn't go away just because you don't like it. I'm not terribly thrilled with my midline right now, but it's not going to go away unless I do something about it. Inclusion is a choice, and it's a choice that you have to actively make, because if you look at the brain science, you look how our brains work, our brains fight against inclusion. We tend to be drawn towards people that are like us in some way, shape, or form, because in having those relationships, we don't have to think as hard. The information isn't new, so it doesn't challenge our brains. The harder we have to think, the more tired we're going to be. So I would challenge your listeners to look around at their friend group, to look around at the people that they are closest to at work. And I would bet dollars to donuts that you will find that the people that you socialize with the most have a lot of similarities to you. They're from the same ethnocultural group. They're from the same gender or sex. They have a similar upbringing. They, whatever. And it's because our brains are fighting against inclusion. So inclusion is a choice, and it is a choice that organizations and individuals have to make in order to make sure that that diversity will thrive.
And one of the things, so now you talk about the fact that one of the questions that you don't get asked enough is, how do we do diversity and inclusion right?
Mm-hmm.
Which makes my job easy, because that's a very easy question to ask you. And it would seem, Michael, like the question everybody should ask you. Yeah. And we've talked a fair bit about it and some of the key pieces, but what's the overall framework for me to go into the office and say, hey, here's how we should be doing D&I, right? And we've laid it out with the business case as the first step, and then you have 4 more steps in the ladder. What do those look like?
Yeah, so it's amazing the number of people that don't ask the question, because they just start doing things. They have potluck lunches, or they roll out unconscious bias training, and they haven't a clue why they're doing it or the impact that that's going to have. And it's a 6-step process. So first is the business case. If you don't understand why, then why are you doing it? The second is some form of assessment. So what's the problem you're trying to solve for? Do you have problems? Do you know what your representation is? If you don't ask the questions, you don't know.
So here's where we're measuring what does our representation look like relative to the population, whether that's the workforce available population or the community that we serve.
Yep, absolutely. That's part of it. So representation is part of it. Inclusion is part of it. How do people feel about their experience in the organization? Do you have the policies and procedures as well as the quantitative and qualitative data to understand where your organization sits? It doesn't have to be hugely complicated, but some form of assessment is important. Then you have to develop a strategy to address the problems that you've identified. What was the problem? What's the solution? Then you have to execute on the strategy. This is where the hard work comes in. It's not terribly complicated. You just have to do it. Then you have to measure. Step 5 is about measuring and figuring out if you've been successful. And step 6 is rinse and repeat, because it's not a linear process. I describe diversity and inclusion as a journey without a destination. You're just going to keep going, and things are going to change, and you're going to have to reassess. So, you might be in the middle of executing on your strategy and something will come up and you'll have to pivot. You might get through your strategy and then you have to go back and reassess. You have to understand if the things that you've introduced have been successful in addressing the problem that you identified. So it is not a linear process. It's a circular process. And it is like any business strategy. It's like any business activity. What's the problem? What's the solution? Execute, measure it, and then figure out if it's had the intended impact. I always use the example of a chocolate bar because I have a bit of a problem with chocolate. And I think about Mars, and I think they should create a blueberry Mars bar. I'm just saying, if anybody's listening, that'd be cool. In order to get that product onto a shelf, it goes through a huge amount of research and development, of market testing, market research. And then when they put the product on the shelf, they measure it within an inch of its life to find out if it's been successful. Who's buying it? Where are they buying it? In what quantities? So if that's the case, and that's a chocolate bar, why does diversity and inclusion not have that same kind of rigor? If this is a strategic priority, it should have that kind of rigor.
And when it comes to measurement, the diversity side of things, obviously very simple to measure, right? Well, not necessarily simple. To what you say in the book, you can only ask the question whether someone chooses to answer or not, and then going to what we talked about. There's so much intersectionality. What are you trying to get at with the questions to get that diversity piece? So it may not be as simple as it seems, but it seems simpler to me to measure than inclusion does.
Theoretically, I don't think of inclusion as being that hard to measure. Representation, diversity, it's about the facts. It's about how do I identify? So you ask people how they identify. They choose to answer or not. Inclusion, measuring inclusion is things like an inclusion survey, which is similar to an engagement survey, but not identical. It's about how they feel about their experiences in the organization. You can do focus groups. You can do one-on-one interviews. You can look at things from a very pragmatic perspective, policies and procedures. Do you have a religious accommodation policy? Do you have accessibility policies? Are they used? I'm thinking about one organization that we did a strategy development piece with, and as part of the inclusion survey, they had these policies in place and no one used them because they were afraid of repercussions. So it's all of these pieces coming together create that assessment. And the demographics, the diversity is one thing. The inclusion, it's not that hard. People are happy to share their experiences, particularly if their experiences have been negative. They will want the opportunity to tell you, provided you do it in a respectful way, preferably anonymous. People will happily share that information with you. And then, of course, you build trust by doing something about it.
Now, let's say you do a 3 times a year engagement survey as a company. Would adding some questions around inclusion be a first step to say, hey, let's take a step in the direction of understanding whether we're an inclusive culture?
Yep, absolutely. You can do it as part of your engagement survey, as long as you're also asking some demographic questions at the same time. Because the key to engagement surveys as well as inclusion surveys is being able to segment the data by demographics. Let me give you an example. So let's say the question is, I am valued at work. It's a pretty generic question. And let's say you get a positive sentiment of 80%. So 80% of respondents said agree or strongly agree. And then you segment the data by, let's say, binary sex of male and female. And what you find is that men are at 95% and women are at 65%. And let's assume for this analogy that women make up 50% of your population. This is an oops moment.
Yeah, I'm having an oops moment as you even suggest the idea of segregating it so that you have that information, because obviously, I don't necessarily need to add any inclusion questions. If do you feel valued at work? And all of my people of color say strongly disagree, then I'm probably failing at inclusion. all I need to do is add some demographical data to it as step one. Do the engagement survey with demographic data. Oh, that's brilliant.
Years ago, I was working with a client and they could not get through their heads how important it was to add demographics to their engagement survey and to look at that data. And I did an analysis of their data, and they had some real problem areas, but they were looking at people through an equality lens, that everyone was the same.
That's right. Yeah.
But when you apply that intersectional lens, it can really start to peel back the layers of the onion.
Huh. That is a very, very interesting way to do it. So earlier we talked about, I'm segueing to something different, because we talked about how to fix our process for hiring, right? But what we didn't do was go to the next step, which is to say, now that we've got a process that works, how do we actually attract diverse people into the organization? How do we do that, Michael?
How long is this podcast? This is a challenging part. You know, a lot of organizations rely on a very simplistic approach to attraction. They put an ad on their website, and maybe they push that out to websites like Indeed and Monster and Workopolis and LinkedIn. But if I just arrived from Somalia and someone tells me that I have to go to this website called Monster, why am I doing that? What is that craziness? It assumes we know where the jobs are. And that's great if you are TD Bank or Google or Facebook or big, big brands. For everybody who isn't a big brand, you're competing against some massive organizations, and it's a lot harder. So in order to diversify the people who are applying for jobs, you have to go to those communities. You have to work with things like immigrant serving agencies to get the word out about your jobs. You can still have them apply through your website. We don't necessarily need a different process, but you have to get out there and let people know that you want to hire them. So immigrant serving agencies, disability organizations, community groups actively go out and advertise in local publications, take out advertisements in languages other than English. You know, get out there into the community, put the word out in order to help them understand that those jobs are available. It's work. And most organizations don't want to do the work. They want it to be instantaneous. And obviously there's things like, you know, you need to have content on your website around diversity and inclusion. You need to have policies posted, you know, that the sort of programmatic stuff needs to be in place as well. But ultimately, it's about doing the legwork to build up your brand, to be known as an inclusive employer so that people will then want to come work for you.
And one of the things you talked about, and you said it was just a rumor, not a stat necessarily, although it ties to something I've seen and you talk about in the book, is that women will only apply for a role when they match 100% of the criteria for that role, whereas men will apply when they match 60%. And so not sure if there is any statistics that do back that up, or whether it's anecdotal. How does that impact bringing in the right mix of people?
Well, it comes back to your job posting.
It comes back to the posting and making sure we don't have criteria that aren't needed.
Right. And people do this all the time. In writing job postings, we say things that are completely unmeasurable. Must be a team player. Who's going to look at that and be like, oh no, I'm not a team player. I can't apply to that job. No. I am out.
Yeah. Well, that eliminates me.
So there's all sorts of stuff in your job postings that it's not necessarily actually required. And on top of that, how are you going to measure it? Are you going to, have a game of touch football to figure out if they're a team player? No, you're not. So making sure that your postings say these are the absolute must-haves and that you can back those up. You can say, yes, they need to have this many years of experience because, and they need to have this specific skill set because. If you're hiring a barista at Starbucks, part of the job is simply good with customers, friendly. How you're going to measure that is you're going to see how they are in the interview. And by the way, everyone lies in interviews. It's 100%. They actually did a study on this one. It's 100% of people lie in interviews. And it may be a white lie or it may be a whopper of a lie, but people are totally lying. But the statistic that you quoted, which is no one can find the source of this, and that is that women require of themselves to have 100% of what's in the job posting versus men at 60%. If that's even remotely true, why does anybody hire men? I mean, hire women. They're going to have a higher bar for themselves. It's probably not even close to that, but there's a lot of debate about that now. And what it comes back to, though, is making sure that you are creating the garden where the flower will thrive, that you are checking yourself and not just falling into old patterns.
Well, a key after that, because I have seen it throughout my career, and you talk about it in the book, is, and there are statistics on this one, is women will, on average, ask for that promotion or ask for the raise with a lot less frequency than men will. And especially straight, white, able-bodied men seem to have a high degree of willingness to ask for money all the time.
We call that entitlement.
Yeah, I didn't want to throw that out there, but it gives you the feeling of that periodic when you're the person being asked. Now, tied to that, are there similar statistics that show that people of color are less inclined to ask for the raise? And given that, if I'm a leader in an organization, what do I need to be doing when it comes to the annual compensation review that is different to ensure that I am treating, and maybe I'm giving a leading question here, but what do I need to be doing to ensure that I'm treating people on my team fairly based on what they're doing versus who's asking for something?
Yeah, this is where I personally like flat compensation models. And what I mean by that is nobody's able to talk you into a higher paycheck. It's statistically true that men tend to be willing to ask for more than women. The research shows that also relates to newcomers. They tend to be less aggressive when it comes to pay negotiation because, of course, the concept of pay negotiation in some countries is completely unheard of. So the way I like to do it, what we do at my organization, is a job has a predefined starting salary. If you're a manager, you start at this rate. There's no negotiation, which I know for some people is a little controversial, but it means that we never have pay inequity. Now you can get bonuses, you can get increases based on experience, based on years of service, based on your performance, but everyone starts from the same place. And we took a lot of time to build this model. It was because, of course, we didn't really have anything else to turn to. We had to make it up as we went. But you have to understand at its core that bias comes into play. That if you're a person that believes that you have to fight for what you want, then when a woman doesn't ask for an increase, she doesn't ask for the higher rate of pay when she's starting, if she doesn't negotiate, then she doesn't want it as much, which is not necessarily the truth at all. It's your bias coming into play. So I believe that we should all just say, yeah, this job starts at $100,000 and you can earn more by doing this, this, and this, but everyone makes the same base pay. And that way, if people are doing average, then they make what they make. But if people are rock stars, they make more. If people are not doing well, then they shouldn't be in the organization anyway. But It's flattening the pay and taking the negotiation out of it.
And then, so flattening the pay when they start, but what about when, it's year 3 and they come in for their raise? Do you just say, hey, you're in year 3, here's the pay for the year 3 role? Like, it has a set amount that it moves by, but does it move by more or less based on performance?
It can.
Okay. So, but you're not tying it to when they ask, you're tying it to whatever preconceived range you built, and you have a predetermined progression through the range based on set criteria.
And then you have the discretionary dollars that are used for bonusing, not for base compensation. Understanding that you have to have a process in place there to make sure that there isn't bias coming into play.
And so salary's one thing, developing our people is another thing. And how can I make sure that I'm developing people of color, women, other intersectionalities on my team well relative to diversity and inclusion, if I'm not today?
This is where systems come into place, where you should have a development program. And that development program should be very formalized, where you should be having a conversation with each person to talk about what they aspire to and not making assumptions about what they aspire to. And you have to have some tough conversations. If you say to me, where do you see yourself in 5 years? And I say, I want your job. And I'm not a CPA. I have to take off my socks to count past 10, then you may have to have the conversation and say, that might not be realistic because you don't have the skills to do the job, plain and simple. But if that's not the case, if I do have the skills to do the job, then the answer should be, okay, here's what we need to do for you to have my job in 5 years. And you lay out a development plan and everyone goes through that same process. They don't have the same development plan because, again, treating people equitably, they don't all have the same needs. So if you need to be put on a big project so you can develop some project management skills, if you need to become certified in change management, if you need, to take some courses or be put on a big file or whatever, we need to be deliberate in the way we develop our people. And everyone gets their own unique development plan to get them to where they want to be, understanding that some people might say, you know what, I'm really good with where I am.
Exactly. Okay. So what we're doing is we're working with them to identify their desires. We're ensuring that in that conversation, we're being clear on whether they actually have the capability or the qualifications to get to where they desire. We're doing a gap identification with them. Okay, that's your desire. What are the missing skills, qualifications, attributes you need to get to where you want to go? And do we both think that you can get there? And if we do, we're putting together a plan built around all of that. And that plan will be very individualized for each person we have the conversation with. And one of the keys, we need to make sure we're having a conversation with each person, not just the single or the straight white able-bodied men that are coming and asking for it. You need to go ahead and purposely have that conversation with every colleague. Just because they're not asking does not mean, and more than likely does not mean, that they don't want it. It just means that they have been raised or trained or taught that they're not allowed to ask. That's not what they do.
If you grew up in India, the idea of asking for a promotion is completely verboten. So if you've got South Asian employees, particularly ones who grew up in India, understanding that there's a difference between being South Asian, growing up in Abbotsford and growing up in Mumbai, then you need to ask the question, what do you aspire to? So it's giving everyone the opportunity to get where they want to go, understanding that some people are not going to ask.
And that's our job, whether it's pay, whether it's a development plan, it's our job as leaders to have those conversations ourselves and to look at the number and say, Ted asked for a raise. I gave it to him because he was right. He's in year 4. Year 4, you generally get a bump. Tina didn't ask for a raise. She's in year 4. She does a better job than Ted. I'm going to give her a bigger raise than we gave Ted, even though she didn't ask, because the metrics tell us that that's what she should get.
If the indicator for a raise is asking, then we have a problem.
Unfortunately, for a lot of the world, I think it is, Michael. And I do think we have problems. And I remember writing an article about, number one way to get the raise you deserve is, well, have you asked for it, right? Have you gone and talked to your boss? And
I have a real problem with that. I mean, just because I asked doesn't mean I should get it.
No. That's just go through the whole qualification process of, do you actually deserve a raise? Because you know what no one ever does, Michael? They never come after a bad year and say, hey, I really shit the bed this year, Clint. I think you should cut me back for a year. I don't think 2022 is going to be any better. Never got that.
No, it's surprising when people, I want to give some of my pay back because I'm crap at my job. No one does that.
Yeah, I felt like I let the team down this year. Can I give 10 grand back?
Yeah, it's not a thing. It's not a thing.
No, it's definitely not. And so one of the things I wanted, we're getting sort of near the end of the time, is how can being deliberate and targeting at levels of leadership help us address the pale, stale, and male syndrome and that many corporations face? And so the first thing, listeners may not know what pale, stale, and male, although probably is reasonably self-explanatory, and it's quite commonly used. You're right. Almost, and scarily almost every organization I've been in, this has been the leadership model. What is it, and how does taking a deliberate and targeted strategy help us address that?
Well, think back to that example that I used earlier where the organization that 75% of leadership were straight, white, able-bodied men and 75% of the entry level were not. You have to be deliberate to make sure that you're retaining the best and the brightest. And that's ultimately this is all about. It's about the best and the brightest should be our leaders. And in order to do that, you need to make sure that people are sticking around, that they have the development opportunities. Because if you're not deliberate, you'll just continue to have the same stuff. If you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got. And you have to look at what is your development program? What does your pipeline of talent look like? I always say to senior leaders, you should have 3 people in mind who could take over your job. And what do they look like? What are the demographics of those people? And if they all look like you, why? This isn't an accusation. This isn't to say, oh, you need to go find a woman who could take over your job. But if they all look the same as you or I do, probably not as handsome, but that's the thing, then just ask why. Ultimately, the leadership affects the brand. It affects how you're known as an organization. Because people look at pictures. They look at the leadership and they say, do I see myself in the organization? And if I look and understand that I am a white man, if I look at a leadership picture and I see all white men, I do not see myself in that organization. So if I don't, then women and people of color won't either. And so that impacts who's applying to the jobs. It impacts who's hired. It impacts your customers. It should never be tokenism. You do not put a person into a job that does not have the skills and ability to do that job. That is a no-no. But you should aspire to have the best and the brightest. And the best and the brightest don't all look like me and you. So, it's a cyclical thing. And, It's about making sure that you are able to attract the best and the brightest. Not because you went out and said, "Oh, we've got to get a black guy for this role." If the black guys aren't applying to the role, then they don't get the role. But the question should be asked, why are they not applying to the role? And if they got the role, they're going to be successful in the role. So there's a whole cyclical process to that. And leadership, let's face it, I mean, leadership controls everything. They set the example, they set the tone, and we need to pay attention to that.
And Michael, the last question I'll ask, because it was one of the harder chapters for you to write, but I thought it was very relevant, was the concept that white man trumps all. And in that chapter, you were really speaking to the areas of intersectionality. What did you mean by that? And how can we use that as we think about diversity and inclusion in our everyday life and the work that we still have to do?
Well, I think it speaks to the need for white men, and particularly straight white able-bodied men, to step up on this conversation. So I used an example in the book. I was giving a presentation, and it was with an organization where the majority of participants were straight white able-bodied men. I went out to dinner with a group of them afterwards, and we were talking about inclusion, and they said, well, what's the big deal? You know, look at you. You're gay, and you're really included with us. And this group was straight white able-bodied men. And I said, yes, but white man trumps all. And what I meant was that if I was a woman, if I was trans, if I were a person of color, I wouldn't have been at that dinner because they would not have welcomed me into that environment. 30 years ago, when I came out of the closet, which is more than 30, but let's not talk about that. That's a very different story. Today, as a white man, I'm just part of the majority. No one cares that I'm gay. It really is irrelevant. But that is not the same experience for all members of the LGBTQ2 plus communities. So, you know, that chapter was the most difficult to write because I am a white man. As much as I'm gay and I live with a disability, I'm still a white guy. And I had an awareness about that as I wrote the entire book. And at the same time, I think it's important for us to understand our privilege as being white men, that I've never been stopped by the police because they didn't think I could afford the car that I was driving. I've never been sexually assaulted at work. I've never been in a meeting and said something and had people ignore me. And these are things that women and people of color and other marginalized or equity deserving groups experience. And we have to understand that privilege. And then we have to use our privilege to the advantage of others. And privilege is a very long conversation. But, you don't have a choice in the matter. As a white man, not like I can change that. So don't get hung up and feel guilty about it. Just do something. Do something with that privilege. It helps everyone. It helps you. It helps your organization. It helps your community.
And so, Michael, as we wrap up, is there anything we didn't cover in our conversation today that you want to get across to the listeners?
I have a new book coming out.
Oh, you do?
I do, yes. I wrote another book. It's called Alphabet Soup, The Essential Guide to LGBTQ2 plus Inclusion at Work. It comes out March 29th. No, I think if there's one thing that I would like people to think about, to get their heads around, everyone has a role to play in this. Every single person has a role to play in this because every single person can create an exclusionary environment. And we all need to play that role or we are never going to get anywhere.
So we all need to do our part to make this world, our workplace, an inclusionary environment.
Absolutely.
It's beautiful. Where can people find you?
You can go to michaelbach.com.
Perfect.
There's all sorts of stuff about me. Or you can find me on social media. I am at the Michael Bach.
At the Michael Bach, and that's across social media platforms?
Yes, except for Facebook, where it's the Michael Bach Official. because that's annoying.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael. I appreciate that.
My pleasure.
Thank you for joining us on The Pursuit of Learning. Make sure to hit the subscribe button and head over to our website, thepursuitoflearning.com, where you will find our show notes, transcripts, and more. If you like what you see, sign up for our mailing list. Until next time, your host in learning, Clint Murphy.